It's very nice to be able to hold this meeting with everyone. We're so honored to have such a fascinating panel of speakers, and we're pleased to have MFA as Migrant Forum Asia to sponsor this event. At TWC2, we sometimes tend to become obsessed with the situation in Singapore. We see problems emerging as a result of policies, and we see new unexpected issues that arise to bedevil the Singapore's migrant community. COVID-19 has also presented an entirely new environment that's impacted migrant workers in ways not experienced by the resident community. But we don't want to dwell on that here. We'd prefer to investigate issues other than those that are brought on by COVID, that preceded the pandemic and are likely to endure beyond it. With the discussion this evening, we hope to learn more about the situation of Bangladeshi workers in other countries. Why Hunger Games? When our team first came up with this idea, I was somewhat confused because I was unfamiliar with the reference. But I checked and I read about the hazards like wayward arrows, poison ivy, bears, bugs, fast flowing rivers, and animals that appear without explanation. And this is a good analogy to the difficult and unexpected nature of migrant work, with little protection and no control of the situation. And yet, Bangladeshi workers are readily enticed to join this game, always hoping for the prize, to be the winner who returns home with the means to turn his family's fortunes and future around, just like the Hunger Games. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. William Goyce, the Regional Coordinator of Migrant Forum Asia. William, could you say a few words for us?
Yes, thanks a lot, Debbie. And thanks, Alex and the team at TWC2 for putting together this webinar. I must say, I think this is every opportunity is a crisis. This is a cliche these days, but there is one of the things that we have found in these last 14 months is the emergence of the essential worker on the global stage kind of thing. As countries deliberate, communicate, and investigate the role that the essential worker has come to play in our lives, in our economies, both in country of destination as well as countries of origin. In many ways today, the migrant worker brings together different communities together and brings a development paradigm together. And so it's fantastic that we are using this opportunity to learn of how in different countries, what this experience has been, of how the migrant worker can be seen as somebody who brings development, but not only development, but brings a greater understanding of who we are as societies, as communities, more than just being in this space of looking at the abuses, exploitations, I think, which are critical to understanding the place that migrant workers play in our lives, but just to be able to also see that it is much more than that. And I think I thank TWC2 as a member of MFA for thinking of this and for bringing, designing this webinar, for being meticulous about the arrangement of it. And as MFA, we are always ready to support something like this. But this initiative that you have taken is definitely an example for other members of ours in the region to look at issues that are important, not only to the organization, but to the society in which you live and move and breathe, because you want to make that connection between the migrant workers and the rest of your society. I think this is a vital understanding that you are promoting today at the regional level and at the global level. So I thank TWC2 for all the work you have done so far. Tremendous work. You're always a fantastic contribution to the understanding of where we need to go in this discourse around migration. And it's fantastic working with you. We've got a fantastic panelist as well today. And I think this is going to be a great moment of learning and also of advancing the agenda of the rights and protection of migrant workers. Thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. Let me introduce this is Alex Au from TWC2. I will be co-moderating the session with Debbie. And first off, let me introduce our panelists. Let's just hope they're all here. I'm not 100% sure, but let me just introduce them anyway. First, we have Professor Ray Jureidini, I hope he's able to hear us now. As usual, we always have all sorts of technical problems, but we'll try to fix that. Ray is a professor of migration ethics and human rights at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. As an expert in this field, governments and the International Labour Organization have consulted with him, and he has also written extensively on the subject of migration. Another panelist we have is from Malaysia. Sumitha Kishna is a lawyer and very much engaged with the Bar Council of Malaysia as well. And at the same time, she is the director of Our Journey, which is an advocacy platform on migration issues. Joy Amdad Hossin started as a migrant worker, but demonstrating what migrants can achieve. He is, since 2017, a social worker with the Namyangju Migrant Welfare Center, located a little east of Seoul in Korea. And last but not least, we have Dr. C.R. Abrar, who is the Executive Director of the think tank Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit in Bangladesh. He has many years of research under his belt, writing and speaking extensively on the subject that we'll be discussing tonight. So without much further ado, let us jump into the meat of this. I just want to check, Ray, are you able to hear us now, Ray?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good.
Oh, good. Because
That's great.
I just
so we are set up, right?
transferred to my telephone, so that seems to be working.
Yeah, that's pretty normal nowadays. We all learn how to kind of cope with all sorts of unexpected technical glitches. Right?
Yes, indeed.
We have two images of you here. Perhaps you'd like to stick to one of them.
Yes. Okay. I'll leave this one.
Doesn't
here.
really matter. Okay. But anyway.
How about that?
Okay.
Yeah.
All
very
right.
good.
That's good. You look.
I mean, who would want two of me? That's fair enough.
Oh, we don't know. We don't know. I'm sure somebody will. Okay. So let's start. Let's start with Dr. Abrar. Dr. Abrar, a lot of the research from your organization, Ramru, has been on recruitment cost. Can you tell us, you're the only panelist from an origin country today, and particularly from an origin country perspective, what are the vested interests and the key players that make this such a thorny issue and so difficult to solve? And any ideas how change can be accomplished?
Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity. And at the outset, let me thank the organizers, TWC2, for championing the cause of migrant workers. And as we understand, it is the Bangladeshi migrants who are your greatest sort of recipients of your services. And that's immense, very important work that you are doing. And thank you ever so much for those of us who work for the rights of migrant workers at home. And in your question, you have really zeroed in, you said vested interests, and that's where it is. I mean, vested interests both in the country of origin, such as in Bangladesh. We have got, the recruitment industry, which is yet to mature, to be an ethical industry. We have, people who are staffing it, very powerful, not being accountable, do not look into the future, do not want to understand the international market, and do not understand the value of skilled migration simply because, they feel that they cannot gain by sending skilled migrants abroad because they can sort of what you call squeeze the labor migrants, who are not that much literate. And they can draw maximum out of that, and who would not be questioning if their rights are violated, if they are mistreated both at home and abroad before going at the countries of destination and upon arrival back. So this is one group that we talk about, and they work in cahoots with the sub-agents and tiers of intermediaries, and all of them benefit from the sort of the cost of migration that eventually migrant workers have to pay. But if we say that that's where the problem is, not so. I guess, although we have got what you call labor laws, migration law and whole range of plethora of institutions that have come into being, the bank, wage earners welfare board, and whole range of things. But somewhere there is a mismatch between the reality and what happens, implementation of those fancy policies, well-meaning policies, but it doesn't happen because, again, the vested interest, they join in together. So that's one side of the story. The other side is the recipient countries. There we have got host of, and that is not talked about much in the different fancy platforms like Colombo processes and Abu Dhabi dialogues. The intermediaries that are there in those countries, the visa trading that goes on, and the receiving countries are totally oblivious to that reality and do not acknowledge that reality. And unless you acknowledge a problem, you cannot solve it. And that is driving up the cost in many ways. That's in the Middle East. And in the Malaysian market, there is syndication. And we all know one of the major accusations against Najib government has been corruption pertaining to bringing in workers from Bangladesh. So although there have been investigation there, but there was syndication at the sending end as well. So there are vested interest group across national borders who are driving up the cost. I will stop there. Maybe in discussion, we'll take this up. So it's a vested interest, that is taking up. You have different forms, different shades, different hues who are driving up the cost of migration.
Abrar, just for the benefit of the Singapore audience, what do you mean by syndication?
Syndication meaning a few individuals or companies, sort of not allowing the free market to operate. And they call the shots. So although, for example, there are 1,000 or more recruiting agencies in Bangladesh, but when it came to sending workers to Malaysia, only 10 or 12 or 20 of them, I forget the exact figure, they were allowed to bring it in. So obviously, if there was competition, then there would have been, it is the powerful people connected with powers that be, they control it, both at our end and also in Malaysia. There were individuals, I won't name names, but powerful people, at the ministerial level and DG and all that, they were all involved. And this came out in Malaysian papers as well. So that's what syndication is all about. So it's not a free sort of thing. So the whole market is hostage in the hands of few.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think one of our panelists is still not yet arrived, right, Debbie?
He's not arrived, which is really a shame because it would be, from Malaysia, it would really be important to hear what you have to say about what Abrar just said. So do you want to go on to your next question then, and we'll see?
Yes, let's move on quickly so that when she does arrive, we have time for her.
Yeah.
So Joy, let's talk a little bit about the minimum wage law in Korea, in South Korea. And now I understand that it is quite high. It is approximately about what, about $1,500 per month. And it applies to migrant workers as well. But are there examples where employers somehow pay less than the minimum wage? And when that happens and a worker feels that he is not paid his salary correctly, how does the worker then solve this problem? What are the ways in which his salary can be recovered? Joy? Turn on your mic, please. Joy,
Joy, you're still muted. We can't hear you. Joy, mic, please. Sure.
Yes, I can see. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So can you translation the English so better for me?
Okay.
It's the Bengali.
Okay, জয় ভাই
বলেন।
আমাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে না?
হ্যাঁ, শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
আচ্ছা, উনি যে প্রশ্নটা করেছে সেটি হচ্ছে কি, কোরিয়ায় যে ন্যূনতম যে মজুরি আইন আছে সেটা তো প্রবাসীদের ক্ষেত্রে প্রযোজ্য, তাই না? তো যে সকল সাধারণ শ্রমিকরা তাদের এমপ্লয়ার দ্বারা অর্থাৎ নিয়োগকর্তার দ্বারা বেতনভুক্ত হয়ে আসে, বাস্তবে তাদের ক্ষেত্রে এটা কতটা প্রযোজ্য, এবং কোনো ওয়ার্কারের যদি এই বেতন সংক্রান্ত কোনো সমস্যা থাকে, সেই সমস্যাগুলো তারা যখন কমপ্লেইন করে সমাধানের জন্য, সেই যে সিস্টেমটা আসলে সেটা কতটা কার্যকরী?
তাহলে আমি উত্তরটা দিচ্ছি। আইন অনুযায়ী সকল শ্রমিকই ন্যূনতম মজুরি পাওয়ার অধিকার রাখে। তবে ন্যূনতম মজুরির হিসাবটা ঘন্টা হিসাবে করা হয়। তবে যেই কোম্পানিগুলোতে 5 জনের অধিক ওয়ার্কার কর্মী আছে, 5 জনের অধিক, ওই কোম্পানিগুলোতে বেতন নেওয়ার সমস্যা হলে সমস্যাটা তেমন হয় না, কারণ যদি মালিক মাসিক চুক্তি অনুযায়ী বেতন না প্রদান করে, ওই ক্ষেত্রে শ্রমিকরা অভিযোগ করলে এর সমাধান পেতে পারে, এর সমাধান পেতে পারে।
Can we stop there and ask for a translation, please?
Yes, yes.
Actually, just now the Joy whatever said, according to the Korean labor law, the all workers have the right to get their minimum wages. Actually, however, the minimum wages is calculated as hourly, but those company have the more than 5 foreign workers. So for this type of company, actually doesn't have any problem if the worker is more than 5%. Okay, even if the employer doesn't pay their salary, so that means as per the monthly contract, whatever the monthly basic salary, if this worker approached and complained against the employer, and they can get the better solution. So just whatever the Joy said.
কিন্তু 5 জনের যেই কোম্পানিগুলোতে 5 জনের নিচে আছে, ওই ধরনের কোম্পানিগুলোতে শ্রমিকদের সমস্যাটা সবচেয়ে বেশি হয়, কারণ মালিক শ্রমিককে ঘন্টা হিসাবে বেতন দেয়। যদি চুক্তি অনুযায়ী 8 ঘন্টা কাজ করার নিয়ম উল্লেখ আছে, কিন্তু মালিক চাইলে তাকে দিনে 4 ঘন্টা 5 ঘন্টা কাজ করাইতে পারে এবং মালিক ওই ঘন্টা হিসাবে তাকে টাকাটা প্রদান করবে। কিন্তু ওই ক্ষেত্রে যদি ওয়ার্কার কোম্পানির জন্য কোনো কমপ্লেইন করে, এটা লেবার কোর্ট থেকে কোনো সমাধান পাওয়া যায় না।
জুল ভাই, আপনি শর্টলি
Can we have a translation, please? Sharina, maybe you want to jump in if
Yeah, hi. Yeah, sure. Everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
If the employer has less than 5 people in his employment, in his company, the hourly wages, the payment for the workers will be on hourly wages. And even though he or she may be entitled to 8 hours a day, the employer can engage them for 4 to 5 hours and pay them that limited amount. And if these workers were to take this to the labor court, usually there is no resolution and they would be just given the hours that they worked.
মূল কথা হলো, এখানে কোরিয়ান শ্রমিক আইনে 5 জনের কম কোম্পানির শ্রমিকরা অনেক অধিকার থেকেই বঞ্চিত হয়। তারা বিদেশি শ্রমিকের মাধ্যমে অনেকেই কোরিয়াতে যে কোম্পানিগুলি আছে, বিদেশি প্রবাসী শ্রমিক তারা নেওয়ার কারণ একমাত্র ওই কোম্পানিগুলিতে 5 জনের নিচে শ্রমিক কাজ করে।
Sharina?
I can continue on.
Yes, please,
Alex? Yeah,
please.
Sure. So if you have less than 5 people in the company, most of the workers who work for those type of companies are in fact deprived a lot of their labor rights. And that's where most of the problems come in Korea.
Can I just ask Joy to just wrap up by just giving us a quick idea, what are the labor rights which are deprived in these other situations? Just list them very quickly and we can move on because Sumitha has joined.
Alex, you cut out there for a second. So
Okay.
you want to know what are...
I want to know what are the other labor rights that have been violated, that are violated in the companies with more than 5 workers? What are the common violations?
In more than 5 workers?
Yeah.
জয় ভাই, যখন কোম্পানিতে 5 জনের বেশি লোক থাকে, তখন কি ধরনের সমস্যা হতে পারে যদি স্যালারি সমস্যা না হয়?
5 জনের অধিক,
ওদের কি ধরনের অধিকার থেকে ওরা বঞ্চিত হতে পারে?
অ্যাকচুয়ালি কোরিয়াতে শ্রমিকদের যে আইনটা আছে, এই আইনটা বিশেষ করে মালিকদের উপর নির্ভর করে তৈরি করছে কোরিয়ার গভর্নমেন্ট। ওই ক্ষেত্রে যেমন 5 জনের অধিক শ্রমিক থাকলে লেবার কোর্টে কমপ্লেইন করলে মোটামুটি সবগুলি সলিউশন পাওয়া যায়। যদি মালিক তার কোনো ড্যামারেজ করে ওয়ার্কারদেরকে, শ্রমিকদেরকে, ওটার সব ধরনেরই ড্যামারেজ পাওয়া যায় কোম্পানি থেকে, কিন্তু 5 জনের নিচে হলে পাওয়া যায় না।
ভাই যেটা বলেছে বেতনের পাশাপাশি আর কি সমস্যা হতে পারে?
আমি তো ওইটাই বললাম যে যে ধরনের সমস্যাগুলি হয়, যেমন মনে করেন যে বাৎসরিক, যে কোরিয়াতে একটা জিনিস কি, যেমন বাৎসরিক ভাতা যেটা আছে।
Can we just wrap up and Sharina just translate that and we can move on, please? We don't want to run out too much time. Sharina?
Sharina?
Hi guys, I have installed over here, so I can't really hear
Okay,
anything.
so,
but I think what he was generally saying was, usually whatever the problems are, without qualifying exactly what those problems are, most are resolved once you take it to the labor court if you have more than 5 employers. But he hasn't really given us any specific details on the types.
Maybe we'll come to that later.
I
Debbie,
think
Sumitha has
yeah.
come in.
Yeah,
Sumitha
okay.
has come in. So let's welcome Sumitha. Debbie, take it away.
Okay. So Sumitha, I hope you didn't have too much trouble logging into the webinar, but certainly glad to have you here. I hope you're ready for your question. Okay. So we were talking about minimum wage in Korea, and so the same thing for Malaysia. What sort of a wage theft do you find taking place in Malaysia? And what forms does this wage theft take? And are there good avenues of recourse for migrant workers there?
Let me just say that the wage theft here is a serious problem. And the type of wage theft most of the cases handled by lawyers and CSOs here either exclusively wage theft cases or have wage theft as one of the violation experienced by the migrant workers. So the types that you have are withholding of wages by the employer or the agent. Then you also have unlawful deduction of wages. Example, they'll deduct for a uniform, or they will deduct for taking medical leave, or they'll even deduct for emergency leave, which is all provided actually by the Employment Act. And there's also another where they don't pay the overtime, or they withhold the overtime payment, or they undercalculate the overtime. And we also, especially during the COVID time, we have seen a lot of workers being asked to take forced leave or forced vacation, And then, of course, you have the problem of arbitrary termination. So when you terminate the worker and you send off the worker in a hurry, then the worker loses his termination benefit and also his wages, maybe in the last month that he is in Malaysia. Other types of wage theft we see is where they send partial wages to the families. So there are migrant workers, I'm not sure exactly why they do this, or maybe they are forced to do it. They have an agreement with the employer to send the wages back home rather than giving the wages in the hands of the migrant. So we see a lot of the migrants, when the wages are sent back home, the employer will only send partial wages, or they will only send the wages sporadically, once in a couple of months or things like that. And then they also play around with the exchange rate, So these are type of the violations that we see in terms of wage theft in Malaysia. And if you see the Employment Act, it does not discriminate against a documented and an undocumented worker. But only the documented worker at this point in time has a recourse in the labor courts, because the Labor Department only recognizes documented workers. However, a lot of the migrants fear filing cases against the employer because of fear of deportation, and also because the practice here, the policy here, allows the employer to arbitrarily terminate, or rather cancel the work permit, unilaterally cancel the work permit of the worker. So what the worker by and large will do is, if they have a problem with the employer, they will try to seek help from the embassy, things like that. But more often than not, they will usually leave the employer to find another employer, hoping that employer will pay their wages properly. So most of the time when we get cases, due to the fear, most migrants prefer that we negotiate with the employer for their wages. we can do that sometimes. Sometimes the employer just doesn't want to pay, you know. And I personally do report the employers to the labor department to conduct a random inspection in usually when they do a random inspection, the employer would not know which worker complained. So it's like going to do a spot check in the company, and then they find the wage theft or they find some violation, and then they will impose on the employer to rectify all that and also find the employer. I find that a better way of dealing with the cases where the worker doesn't want to report or doesn't want to disclose his personal details and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, can I just ask a little follow-on question, even though we're we're always short on time on these things? You mentioned lawyers. Is it required for a worker to have a lawyer to bring up his salary complaint? And the other thing is, what sort of, you talk about negotiating with employers. Is the settlement from that negotiation, is that usually a satisfactory settlement, or does that usually result in only partial payment of what the worker feels he was owed?
In terms of lawyers, you do not need a lawyer to represent you. You can represent yourself. But of course, the language barrier is a problem for a lot of migrant workers. So they will either have a civil society organization helping them, or a trade unionist, or a lawyer helping them in those kind of situations. Sorry, what was the other case you mentioned? The negotiations.
What sort of success rate do you see as a result of those complaints that are brought up?
I don't think that we have where we can say that all the cases are what do you call that?
Successful
and everyone gets what they deserve, because there are also instances, and we don't blame the workers. There are also instances where the worker will take whatever is given to them because he just wants to go back home. So if, say, suppose the worker is owed 20,000, they may just get about 10,000 or 12,000, and the worker said, "No, I'll just take it and go back." So I wouldn't say that all the cases are successful in that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so shall we go on to the next question for Ray? Yeah.
Ray.
Ray, you've done research on food security. And can I ask, how did this become an issue? And could you share some of the observations from your research into food security?
Sure. Well, we've just begun this research project on food security. As you know, it's a worldwide issue. And in fact, Qatar's had a food security policy since 2008. But what we have been funded to do is to actually do a socioeconomic analysis of food security, specifically with migrant workers and the vulnerable. So vulnerable being, low skilled, low income, low educated migrant workers. And also, though, there are people who are now unemployed, families who are unemployed, and there are all kinds of people who are in difficult circumstances. The numbers we don't know yet, but that's something that we're going to try to get some statistics on. But what's important is that the people who are vulnerable are those who are not receiving any food from their employers, nor a food allowance. So there are three categories: those who are receiving food from their employers, which is probably the vast majority of workers, and then those who are receiving a food allowance, and those who are not receiving anything, neither an allowance nor food. And so just recently, the government has introduced a new minimum wage of 1,000 rials, and along with that, a minimum food allowance, as well as a minimum accommodation allowance for those who are not receiving them from their employers. So, when I was helping to develop the Qatar Foundation standards for migrant worker welfare, this was a big issue, and the recommendation is always that the employers should provide food for their employees, 3 meals a day. And if it's lunchtime, to provide the lunch at the work site. What we discovered was that people who are getting food allowances often will send those food allowances back home to their families because they want to maximize their income as a salary and send home. And we discovered in one company, they had something like 100 workers in hospital suffering from malnutrition because they were starving themselves. So this was the reason why we wanted to make sure that, that's the kind of arguments. And also what's happened recently is that the blockade, the 3 years of the blockade of Qatar has meant that they were, before the blockade, they were 90% dependent on imports for food. And that's a tremendous dependency. They challenged that over the last 2 or 3 years, where they are totally reliant upon themselves in the country for all of their dairy needs and about up to 30% of the vegetables that are needed. So despite the initial fears of the food security, as in most countries with COVID, you know, the Qatar government moved quickly to make sure that there was access to food. And there are charities here for people who are in dire straits and who need food. There's Qatar Charity, there's the Qatar Red Crescent, and the Qatar Zakat Fund. And so there are places to go and to be referred to from many institutions to receive help. So we're just at the beginning. We're going to do a big, large survey, and we're also going to get a number of workers to do a diary of their food intake and any money that they're spending on food as well, so that we can compare the three kinds of categories.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Alex, you're muted.
Sumitha, I'm coming back to you. We lose the train of thought because you mentioned something about undocumented workers in passing just now. So this can be relatively new to the Singapore audience. But I know that in Malaysia, you have a rather large pool of undocumented workers. But why don't you tell us something about how workers move from documented to undocumented status? That's aside from those who just cross the border in a sampan, in a boat. Would a worker actually be happier in terms of the salary he can command, in terms of his own freedom, to be undocumented as opposed to documented and tied to a particular employer? I mean, what's your take on that?
So the first question is how they become undocumented. Malaysia, although we have borders, we are quite porous, where you do have people coming in through the borders, like what you mentioned, through the boats. But it's not for all migrants who come. Usually, it's the Bangladeshis and the Myanmaris who come through that way, and also the Indonesians. But by and large, migrants do come with proper documentation. But then when I say proper documentation, they may come with a student visa, they may come with a social visa, or they may come with a visa that is a work permit. But then when they come into the country, either they leave the employment or because of some abuse, or they are looking for some other better work, or the employer does not renew their work permit. And so the system here is such that the worker has no way of legalizing himself or renewing his work permit. It's all dependent on the employer. So these are some of the reasons why the worker becomes undocumented. But in terms of your second question that you asked, no, it's not that migrants prefer to stay undocumented. What some of them prefer is not to be tied down to a singular employer, where they have set hours of work and a minimum wage of 1,200. That's our minimum wage. That is what they don't want. It's not as if they want to be undocumented. So there's a lot of difference in that. So in Malaysia, we have workers who are undocumented and workers who are in reality, well, inverted commas, self-employed, but holding visas with employers, sometimes whom she or he may not even have met. How that happens is we have a quota system in Malaysia to recruit migrant workers. So employers have a quota system. And some companies who have additional quotas that have not been utilized, they would sell that visa to a worker either directly or through an agent. And that's how the worker holds the visa from another company that is not his employer. And it's very difficult to remain totally undocumented in Malaysia unless you are able to talk to authorities into not arresting you. Of course, possibly through bribes and all that. But by and large, migrants would try to find one way or another to obtain any visa that will allow them to remain in Malaysia. So I think it's a myth to say that all workers are happy being undocumented or some workers are happy being undocumented. No, that's not true.
But what you've really sketched is that any attempt to over-regulate the labor migrant such that he is left with very few choices tends to create all these social problems and social externalities, because it's going to take micromanaging by the government to keep on top of the situation. So sometimes over-regulation can be going too far, can be more of a problem, a reasonable amount of freedom. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, I would prefer that, like, say, suppose the migrant is here for a couple of years and he's given a leeway to have a visa that is not tied down to his a particular employer, or he's even given the leeway to change employment. Even that the migrant doesn't have in this country. So no matter how much abuse that he goes through, he is stuck with that employer. So and it takes a lot. The employer that is abusing him, or the employer who is originally on the work permit, needs to give consent to the worker for him to change employment. So if you actually do away with that kind of restriction, then maybe the workers will be a bit more will have more freedom to change employment when they are facing a problem with the current employer. You know, I think that would be a better way. Of course, I don't think Malaysia is going to be very, very far away from giving free visas and self-employment is very, very far away. But I would definitely urge the government to move away from restricting employment to one employer. Yes.
Unfortunately, much of that sounds very familiar to us in Singapore, and it's exactly the same. It's being tied to a single employer. So Joy, the next question is going to you, and that's about changing employers. So how easy is that in Korea to change jobs? Is that something that workers can do easily, or are there some of the same restrictions like you've heard Sumitha talk about? Can we have a translation? Maybe
Shafiqul, you should keep your microphone on, don't mute that, so that you can automatically translate.
Okay, Shafiqul, would you do that, please?
Yeah, Joel bhai. জিজ্ঞেস করছে কোরিয়ার চাকরির পরিবর্তন সম্পর্কে। তো চাকরির যে 2 নম্বর প্রশ্নটা, যে চাকরি কি সহজেই পরিবর্তন করা যায় নাকি এক্ষেত্রে কতটা কঠিন, কোনো বাধার সম্মুখীন হতে হয় কিনা?
আমি উত্তরটা দিচ্ছি। বিদেশি শ্রমিকদের নীতিগতভাবে প্রথম নিযুক্ত কোম্পানিতেই অনবরত কাজ করতে হয়।
The worker has to work with the employer that he comes to the country with initially.
তবে কোম্পানি সাময়িক বা অস্থায়ীভাবে কোনো কারণে বন্ধ হয়ে গেলে অথবা বকেয়া বেতন থাকলে।
But for whatever reason, if the company were to shut down,
অথবা বকেয়া বেতন থাকলে,
or if there's unpaid wages,
ওই ক্ষেত্রে একজন প্রবাসী ন্যূনতম 3 বার লিগ্যাল ভাবে 3 বার কোম্পানি চেঞ্জ করতে পারবে।
In that case, a worker can change the company legally up to 3 times.
Up to 3 times within a certain period of time? Or
সময়ের ভিতরে 3 বার নাকি indefinitely ও যতদিন ওই দেশে থাকে?
ওই প্রথম অবস্থায় 3 বছরের কন্ট্রাক্ট থাকে, ওই 3 বছরের মধ্যে।
Within the first 3 years of his contract, and initially when you come in, you have a 3-year employment contract.
তবে তবে কোনো প্রবাসীরই কাজ নিজের ইচ্ছায় কোম্পানি চেঞ্জ করাটা সম্ভব না।
But voluntarily, a worker cannot change his employment.
If the company has gone bankrupt or the company did not pay his wages, how does the worker get a new job? Does he find a new job himself, or does he go back to the government to ask the government to help him find a new job? Sharina or Shafiqul?
কোম্পানি যদি ব্যাংকরাপ্ট হয়ে যায়, ঠিক আছে, আর যদি স্যালারি যদি না যায়, তাহলে ও কিভাবে নতুন জবের খুঁজে পাবে? সে কিভাবে কোনো একটা জবটা খুঁজে পেতে পারে?
হ্যাঁ, এখানে কোরিয়ার গভর্নমেন্ট একটা জব সেন্টার খুলে রাখছে বিদেশিদের জন্য, প্রবাসীদের জন্য। ওই তার কাজ চলে যাওয়ার পরে সে ওই জব সেন্টারে যাইয়া কমপ্লেইন করতে হয়।
There is a job center that has been opened up by the Korean government for foreigners. When a worker loses his or her job, he can go and complain at the job center.
But 3 মাসের ভিতরে তার অন্য কাজে যাইতে হইব, আর নয়তো সে ভিসাবিহীন হয়ে যাইব, তার দেশে চলে যাইতে হবে।
But he has to secure a job within 3 months of his last date of employment, or he will be repatriated back and lose his legal visa status in the country.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I will now turn to Ray, because this is the 3 months thing is very similar to what Qatar has introduced, isn't it? So in addition to introducing the minimum wage and the minimum food allowance and the minimum housing allowance, which you spoke about earlier, last year Qatar also introduced this system where after losing a job or even after just voluntarily resigning from a job, a migrant worker in theory has 3 months to look for a new job. He doesn't have to be repatriated straight away. Am I reading the situation? Am I correct in that? Am I reading the situation correctly? And from what you know or what you've heard in a short time since the change, has it made a real difference, or is it largely ignored? What do you think, Ray? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. This was really a reform that was quite profound in its potential to actually develop a local labour market. That is, where workers do not need permission from their employer sponsors to change employers and work for somebody else, and without having to leave the country. And that was considered to be the end of the kafala system, the notorious kafala system. However, we currently, my perception is that many employers and employees simply don't understand this situation, and that they still believe that they require what's called an NOC, or a non-objection certificate or letter from their employer saying that they agree. In other words, getting permission from their current employer. That is, if they have not completed their contracts. And even if they have completed their contracts, of course, they're allowed to leave and find another job. But what happened was that the ministry issued a follow-up when the legislation was brought in, and said that the employee has to provide the letter of resignation to the ministry when they apply to transfer employers. Now, this letter of resignation, of course, is required. Workers who've been working 2 years or less than 2 years required to give 1 month's notice. If they've been working for more than 2 years, they're required to give 2 months' notice. And so the ministry wants to see that letter of resignation that gives the notice. Now, the key thing here is, does the employer have to sign that letter in order at least to say that they have received the resignation letter in compliance with the law? And does that de facto mean that they're giving permission or not giving permission? And what happens if they don't sign it? So there is this little administrative confusion where even I don't understand what the reality is. Now, that being said, many thousands have actually successfully changed their employers. But this is still a vexed issue as to how well it's working, how well it's being implemented, and the question mark around this letter, right? So what is it, and what role does it play? What one is, what on the surface does it look like, but what is behind it, and what it can be used for is another thing. So so it's double-edged right now, and we're waiting to have more analysis of what's going on.
Thank you. Sounds very similar.
Yes,
thank you. Yes, sounds very similar because we too in Singapore, we have all nice, sometimes very nice sounding laws, but at the actual implementation and the operationalizing of these laws, bureaucrats may impose their own administrative requirements, and that kind of like adds terrible complications to what must have been a well-intended change in the law. But that's how, I suppose, how things work. Yeah?
Well, of course, what's also behind it, there's no doubt in my mind that many employers opposed it. It undermines their fundamental authority that they have had for so long to control their labor force, right? That the rug has been pulled from underneath them in that respect, and so there's a lot of tension.
Yep. We can fully understand that they wouldn't be happy about that.
Right.
Okay. The next question is for Abrar. I hope you're there. Okay. So, it often seems when we talk to Bangladeshi workers that their only choice for to do anything is to migrate, to go to a foreign country, to work in a place like Singapore. And yet Bangladesh has had several years already of per capita GDP growth. And since that's the case, when do you think Bangladesh would be ready to reduce its reliance on labor emigration and perhaps be able to supply more jobs for young men at home rather than have their only choice become migration?
There are two things that I'll say. I mean, while Bangladesh is internationally known to be a source country, labor source country, it is also a labor receiving country. And this may come as a surprise to some of you, at least, if not many. Mainly, I mean, and this is where the crux of the matter is. We have got this industrialization program, which demands skilled labor, but we have not produced enough labor, skilled labor, appropriately skilled labor, to staff those positions in apparel manufacturing industry, in which Bangladesh is a world leader, I mean, along with others, few others. And also in whole range of education, then whole range of other industries as well. And these are being staffed by Sri Lankans and Indians. And Bangladesh is the fourth largest, and it hovers around fourth of the fifth largest remittance source country for India. So in that respect, we have got this huge foreign labor working here, where our own labor force is going overseas as unskilled labor. So this is where the mismatch between the reality and the second issue is, in terms of the way, I mean, skill development and other things are seen as infrastructure development. The government measures its success, in terms of how many technical training centers they have set up. Without looking into to what extent the trainings that are imparted in those training centers are catering to the needs of local industry as also globally. I mean, if you have a policy to send workers abroad, you better have simple example. Some years ago, when I was doing a small study, there we came across the technical training center principal telling me that, look, we have got this training in window air conditioning, whereas global world has moved into different kinds of air conditioning system. and that kind of, not recognizing the reality, having to, change gear with the, sort of demand that's there. So that has been a major problem. The other issue here is, the jobs that are being created at the lower end, that is not many. The supply is huge, but it is essentially a jobless growth at the lower end of the skill spectrum. And therefore, where do these people go? The aspirations are there, and they really would like to move on. So in the foreseeable future, I think this trend would continue. I would reckon. I hope I'm wrong, but that's the given reality. And so there are a lot of policy issues in this regard. And so I'll stop there. I think I've taken my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me come back to Joy. Okay, so Joy, you've been a migrant worker for many years before you settled down in Korea, and you still work with migrant workers through the Namyangju Migrant Welfare Center. What are the kinds of problems that Bangladeshi workers face when they arrive in Korea? Maybe not just Bangladeshi workers. I mean, I know there are, workers from Vietnam, from Philippines, even from Uzbekistan and China. What sort of problems do they face? For example, housing problems, maybe different kind of food, maybe racial prejudice or language problems. Tell us about the kinds of problems that a migrant would face in a country like Korea. Shafiqul, you want to try quickly?
জয় ভাই, কোরিয়াতে আসার পরে যে অভিবাসী শ্রমিকরা, ধরেন বাংলাদেশি আছে, ভিয়েতনাম আছে, যে সকল অভিবাসী শ্রমিকরা আছে, এরা আসলে কোন ধরনের সমস্যাগুলো ওখানে ফেস করে? যেমন এখানে উনি বলেছেন যে ভাষাগত একটা সমস্যা থাকে, তারপর আপনার খাদ্য সংক্রান্ত একটা সমস্যা থাকে, যে সবাই ওই ধরনের খাবার খেতে পারে, এই ধরনের কিছু একটা, তারপর জাতিগত যে ভেদাভেদ, যেটা থাকে, আর আপনাদের ডরমিটরি অথবা হাউজিং এ থাকার যে ব্যবস্থা, এগুলোর কথা বলেছে। এই সমস্যাগুলো থাকে নাকি এর বাইরে আরো কিছু সমস্যা সেখানে আছে?
সবচেয়ে বেশি সমস্যাটা আমাদের বাংলাদেশিদের, কারণ কি আমরা মুসলিম কান্ট্রি, এজন্য কোরিয়ানদের সব খাবারের মধ্যেই শুকরের মাংস থাকে। এজন্য যে 4টা কথা বলছে, যে ভাষা, খাদ্য, তারপরে বাসস্থান এবং জাতিগত ভেদাভেদ, এই 4টা সমস্যাই প্রথম অবস্থাতে আসলে সব দেশি, আমাদের বাংলাদেশিরা সবচেয়ে বেশি এটার মুখোমুখি হয়।
Of the 4 issues that was listed in terms of language, social, prejudice, cultural, Bangladeshis are the ones who face almost all of these when they initially come, and that the majority of the reason behind that is that the food is, because we come from a Muslim country, the food is not something they can consume because most food has some pork ingredient or another in it.
What about the conditions of the housing?
যে বাসস্থানের যে ব্যবস্থাটা আছে, সব কোম্পানি, বেশিরভাগ কোম্পানিগুলি ছোট ছোট কোম্পানি, এজন্য তারা কি করে, কোম্পানির ভিতরে ছোট করে একটা রুম করে, ওই রুমের মধ্যেই প্রবাসীদেরকে থাকতে দেওয়া হয়। এক্ষেত্রে প্রবাসীরা খুবই মানসিকতায় ভোগে, কারণ এটা হলো ফ্যাক্টরির ভিতরে থাকে রুমটা।
Most of the employers are small employers with less than 5 people. And in this situation, there is no proper housing, end up making a room within the factory for the workers, which for the workers is a mental hardship to suffer.
And do they then, are they able to cook if they live in the factory? I mean, where are they going to get food like this?
জুয়েল ভাই, আচ্ছা, ওই যে কোম্পানির ভিতরে যেখানে থাকে, ফ্যাক্টরির ভিতরে, সেখানে কি রান্না করার সুযোগ আছে? এবং রান্না করার সুযোগ থাকলে এটা যোগ করে দিন, আসলে তারা কিভাবে বাজার করে, এটা একটু বলে দিন।
হ্যাঁ, বিশেষ করে হইলো যেমন ছোট ফ্যাক্টরিগুলিতে দুপুর পর্যন্ত, এরা লাঞ্চের পর্যন্ত তারা খাবারের ব্যবস্থা করে, কিন্তু বাংলাদেশিরা ওই শুকরের মাংস বেশি থাকায় তারা নিজেরাই কুক করে। আর কোরিয়াতে প্রচুর পরিমাণ হালাল ফুডের দোকান আছে, তাদের কাছে কল করলে তারা ওই যে ধরনের ব্যবস্থা আর কি পাক করার রান্না করার যে সামগ্রীগুলি আছে তারা দিয়ে যায় এবং ওই ফ্যাক্টরির ভিতরে ওই রুমের ভিতরেই তার এক রুমের ভিতরেই পাক করতে হয়, ওই রুমেই থাকতে হয়, ওই রুমেই তার টিভি দেখতে হয়, সাপোজ একটা রুমের ভিতরে তার জীবনযাপন করতে হয়।
Generally, most of the employers provide meals up until lunch, but because of the non-halal ingredients in the meals, the workers usually tend to call up halal stores where they can order whatever it is that they need to cook their own meals, and delivery is relatively easy, and then they cook within those rooms inside the factories where they are domiciling.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Joy. Over to you, Debbie.
Okay. The next question for you, Ray. It looks as if Qatar has workers from a lot of different nationalities, including even Africa. So in Singapore, we have, certain, fewer nationalities that are able to come here and do this kind of low wage work. But we find that Bangladeshis are always paying the highest recruitment fees. So in Qatar, what are the recruitment fees like, and how does that play out by different nationalities?
Right. Well, it's the same. It's the same here. Bangladeshis pay the most pre-departure, and they get the least post-arrival in terms of wage levels. And the low-paying jobs are filled by workers from India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and to some extent Philippines. Philippines tend to have the highest earnings. And increasingly from Africa. Currently, the main countries they're coming from are Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. That's another developing market for labor. But look, let me, I can't answer this question properly without addressing this issue of the use of the term fees. And I have this horrendous opposition to the term fees. The usage of the term fees gives some legitimacy to what workers are paying for these jobs. Bangladeshis are paying on average more than anybody else except Pakistanis. And they're paying on average, from the research that we've done, is about $3,300 for these jobs. Now that is not a fee for the services of the recruitment agent, right? It's far too large. And it's what we know and what Abrar, alluded to, but I'm going to make much more explicit, is that, it's to feed the corruption. It's to feed bribery. And not just the bribery and to feed people who want some of that money in Bangladesh. And we know that there are some, I think I've been told that there are some members of parliament who own recruitment agencies. But the thing is that there's money that's being given to the personnel of the employing company in the country of destination. That is the payment that is given. It's what we call a kickback bribe or a kickback payment for whoever is actually choosing that agency to get the contract to provide the labor. Now, for Bangladeshis, I have seen on paper saying that they will pay $1,000 per worker to the employer. I've seen another one that said $1,500. That's the kind of margin that that exists with the amount of money that Bangladeshis are paying. So where does that money go? So $1,000 per worker. Before COVID, there was about 500,000 Bangladeshis leaving Bangladesh every year. At $1,000, $500 million leaving the country with them in order to pay the kickback payments. So those things, everybody knows about it. It's not a secret. everybody knows about it, but very few people are doing anything about it. The Supreme Committee for the World Cup here has instituted a policy whereby the that workers are paid is to be reimbursed by their employers, right? So they're getting the money that they paid is being paid back to them on a monthly basis, and they've developed a model of how to calculate that. So, you know, there are other things that this money pays for as well. I don't know if you want me to go into that, but it's rather some sordid things when the personnel of the employing company go to Bangladesh or whatever country it is, actually, to do the testing of the workers' skills. They need to be put up in a hotel, pay for their restaurants, and, you know, guests in the middle of the night. And who pays for that? The agent. And where does the agent get that money? From the workers. This is how that money is being distributed, along with the profits for all the stakeholders involved. So this money that is being called fees is a nonsense and should not be accepted. They should not be paying anything, right? And I even disagree with there are many economists around the place who want to reduce those costs because they call it the cost of migration. It's not a legitimate cost, I'm sorry. The labor law in Qatar forbids workers being charged for recruitment. The same in the UAE, right? So there's something wrong going on here. In Bangladesh, the government allows up to 3 months' salary being paid to the agency. So that legitimates, you know, about $800 or something like that to be paid. So it's a vexed issue. It's one that I'm, you know, feel very strongly about. And I think that workers need to be aware that what they're paying is being used for, well, corrupt practices. So that I'm sorry.
That's all right, Ray. I think I think that's very clear enough, loud and clear. So very quickly, Sumitha, very quickly, just the same thing, you know, right? The U.S. Customs and Border Agency has found that two Malaysian latex glove manufacturers have been taking these kickbacks, and they have therefore banned the importation of latex gloves from these two companies into the United States. So that's one party out there that's taking some sort of action,
yes,
right? But here's a question to Sumitha. Is this going to really change, you know, just to give us a brief answer? I mean, is this really going to change the behavior of Malaysian companies, or are most companies going to take the view, oh, it won't happen to us, you know, or, you know, tell us, what do you think? What's the impact of this?
Okay, I mean, let's be realistic. Most of the violators in Malaysia are actually the SMEs, and they are usually at the bottom of the supply chain. And I remember during our discussion with the US authorities, they did admit that they are unable to trace the supply chain beyond the second or the third tier. Okay, so while the case against Top Glove, it may impact companies in similar standing as Top Glove. But it's going to be very difficult to clean up the whole supply chain if you are not able to identify violators beyond the second and third tier. Having said that, we have Western governments taking a keen interest on ensuring products imported from Malaysia are made by companies who conform with international labor standards. But we have not yet seen the impact on employers as a whole. We have not seen that yet.
Early days, right? Because it's only been last year that they took the action. But it's a step forward, you would agree, I think. And we need to let people know that this kind of thing can happen to your fantastic sales and marketing plan if you don't watch out. Right. Over to you, Debbie.
Okay, so a final question for you, Abrar. Climate change is such a hot topic these days, and that, of course, is causing all kinds of disastrous climate situations and problems that force people on the move. So are there plans that are being made to combat this or to address these issues in Bangladesh?
No, I mean, this is something, absolutely, this is the reality. And as we all know, Bangladesh has been one of the most highly vulnerable countries of the world. And international estimates, International Displacement Center, by 2050 in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, 143 million people will be displaced, and of them 13 million will be in Bangladesh alone. So that's the magnitude of problem that we are talking about. But having said that, these are slow onset processes. It's not the cyclones and others. It's the sea level rise, a whole range of salinization of the agricultural fields, and those kinds of riverbank erosion. Those are some of the things that are taking toll and would lead to a lot of displacement. And in respect to disaster, over the years, Bangladesh has really sort of developed, they have honed in how to manage that. So the magnitude of large scale, what you call disasters like cyclones, we have cyclone shelter and warning, what you call early warning system. Those are in place. And now the government has moved on, and Bangladesh is the second country in the world to have a policy for internal, displacement management. And that is something, and that's where we are privileged to be part of that, policy document that was prepared for the Ministry of Relief and Environmental Disaster. And so that has been accepted by and now the strategic plan is being developed. And it takes into account, sort of what we call pre-disaster, during disaster, and then how to cope with in the long term. So that national strategy is now they are developing the working plan is being sort of developed, and we are part of that process. So I think it is in this respect, there is acknowledgement, and the policies that are being framed appear to be in sync with the reality for a change, unlike other sectors, because they are taking into proper stride the civil society input, the climate scientists, and a whole range of things. And so that's where I think significant progress are being made. So although we are faced with this inevitability, there is also a degree of recognition. And my final point is, earlier internal migrants were viewed, and even by, town planners and others, as threat to urbanization. And this is where our research unit and few of our colleagues, we came in and we said that, look, don't treat them, don't securitize internal migrants. If you have industries to have proper allocation for people to live in, to staff those industries, and they have to commit land and other forms of establishment, so that instead of as threat to urbanization or pressure on urbany, you have to acknowledge the reality and provide services to these migrants and do according plan. And that's where we are heading. So in a way, I would say we are hopeful in this particular regard. Thank you.
Let's move quickly into the Q&A, shall we, Debbie? Because we are running behind time, and I think I can combine really two questions. One from Gyun Ju Lee asking Joy how easy it is to find for a migrant, maybe living in a small town, to find a job center if he needs to look for a new job. And secondly, on a similar note, a question from Russell Heng asking Joy also that if the worker does find a new job, is it common for the new employer to also ask the worker to pay to get the new job? Shafiqul, can you translate my question?
জয় ভাই, প্রথম প্রশ্নটা ছিল যদি কোনো শ্রমিক লোকাল এরিয়ায়, যেটা প্রপার টাউনে না, যদি আমরা লোকাল এরিয়ায় থাকে, ছোট শহরে, সেখান থেকে সে কিভাবে এই জবটা খুঁজবে?
তাহলে আমি প্রথমটার উত্তরটা দিতেছি। যেমন ওই জব সেন্টার থেকে প্রথম যখন তার চাকরিটা চলে যায়, তখন জব সেন্টার খুঁজে না পাইলে প্রতি এরিয়াতে আমাদের মতো এরকম মাইগ্রেন্ট সেন্টার আছে।
Even if there isn't a job center in the locality where the worker has been displaced, there are migrant centers in smaller towns that he can approach.
তখন ওই লোক মাইগ্রেন্ট সেন্টার আসলে আমরা তাকে জব সেন্টারের পুরো ডিটেইলস দিয়ে দেই, কোন জায়গায় আছে, কিভাবে যাইতে হবে। দেওয়ার পরে সে জব সেন্টারে যায় কমপ্লেইন করে। কমপ্লেইন করার পরে তার কাছে যখন তার চাকরি হবে তার কাছে একটা মেসেজ আসে তার মোবাইলের মধ্যে।
And other question is, when the worker is successful in getting another job, does the new employer ask for payment?
Just to wrap up the earlier question, the rest of the answer was the migrant center usually connects the worker to the job center, wherever the closest one is, and the worker will then proceed over there and make his complaint and look for a job. And when he does get a job, he's notified via SMS.
Okay. দ্বিতীয় যে প্রশ্নটা ছিল, ধরেন ওই শ্রমিকটি জব পাওয়ার পরবর্তীতে নতুন যে কোম্পানিতে যায়, ওই কোম্পানির বস কি তাকে পে করার জন্য, অর্থাৎ কোনো এজেন্ট ফি কোনো ধরনের পে করার জন্য বলে?
না, এটা কোনো ধরনের নতুন অবস্থায় কোনো ফ্যাক্টরিতে গেলে মালিক তার কাছে কোনো কিছু পে করতে বলে না।
No, employer do not require any kinds of payments when they get the job.
Thank you. My sense is that Korea is different in that the government seems to be quite proactive in making its services direct to the workers, and therefore helps to reduce this, as Ray calls it, the big corruption problem that might otherwise exist. Debbie, do you have a favorite question there that you want to pick up and let our panelists
Okay, here's
answer?
one that's interesting because it's something that we haven't brought up yet. It's about how are Bangladeshi workers treated in the criminal justice systems, given the racism and prejudice. They're vulnerable due to their employers' control over them and the economic vulnerabilities. So how are they treated when they end up in the criminal justice system? Maybe Ray, maybe you can say something about
and
that.
Maybe Sumitha can chip in a little bit as well.
Sumitha would be good too. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what's meant by the criminal justice system. In other words, what they've been accused of or what they've been convicted of, whether they are actually criminal acts that they have committed. And those who actually have committed crimes of one kind or another, I'm not that familiar, but what I am more familiar with is where there are certain behaviors that are considered to be criminal, which I don't believe are criminal. And we are working to try to reform them and to decriminalize them. And one of the key elements there is the so-called absconding from the employer. Now, this is something that employers have used for a long, long time against workers. So that if the worker makes a complaint, for example, for non-payment of wages or for wage theft, the employer might turn around and register that they have absconded from their employment. And what that means is once they've registered them as having absconded, they will withdraw their residency permit and work permit, which makes them illegal residents in the country. And they can be then arrested and detained and deported. This is an issue that now with the new reforms in particular doesn't make any more sense, because if in principle a worker can leave their place of work without permission from their employer, the whole idea of absconding makes no sense, right? So that's what we're putting to have this changed. We haven't been successful yet, but they're very aware of it, and that's on the agenda. So that's one big issue I think that's important, because workers do not leave, even if they're being abused, because of these circumstances, whereas they should be able to leave and they should be able to claim compensation, in fact, for breach of contract, etc. Now, the Qatar government has set up now tribunals for all of these kinds of issues that workers can actually make grievance claims in the courts, or even just online if they don't want to, if they want to remain anonymous. Other kinds of criminal activity, I'm sorry, I really don't know. I haven't looked into that.
Okay. Thanks. That's a really good point about absconding, because it's something that we hear about often here as well.
Oh, really?
Well, claiming that worker has absconded. Yeah.
Just to add to that, the very idea of absconding or running away is a term of slavery, right? And that's needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
Sumitha, you probably have a lot more experience dealing with criminal justice cases.
I think criminal justice system where migrant workers are concerned is the most difficult, because one is they do not have legal aid for foreign nationals when it comes for criminal justice system, although we have the same for locals. Secondly, although bail is available for migrant workers, embroiled in criminal cases, it's impossible to get a bailor who is Malaysian to sign for you. So even if the person is innocent, until proven guilty, he's sitting in prison, waiting pending his trial. So, but I always tell the migrant, if you are not guilty, please do not plead guilty in any circumstances for a criminal offense, because a lot of people think that, okay, I plead guilty, I can go back home and I can continue my life. No, that's not what happens, because your prospects of remigration actually gets affected very badly. In the country that you say, suppose you're in Malaysia and you have a criminal offense and you pleaded guilty, if you want to apply to go to Singapore later, it will be a problem. So we always tell migrants, if you're not guilty, do not plead guilty. And also, unfortunately, we are unable to get him bail, so he will have to stay in prison until his trial is heard. But there are instances where we do make a lot of effort to push the case, to expedite the case to come to trial as quick as possible. Yeah.
So I want to pick up a question from Arwen Joyce, it's for Ray, because this is something that's also interested me for some time, because there are she says there are 14 government-run visa centers in 6 sending countries that has been set up by Qatar. And they're supposed to be the only legal channel for low-wage migrant workers to gain entry. Actually, what do these visa centers do? And what effect has their setting up had on recruitment costs?
I know a little bit about it. In fact, I think it's 18 centers that have been established in the main origin country, labor origin countries. They were set up primarily, in fact, it was the UAE who more or less pioneered this first. It was to set up an office in country of origin so that all the paperwork could be done pre-departure, as well as having only one medical test with in an approved medical testing institution, because there's been a lot of fraudulent, documentation about medical tests in the past. And another reason was that the contract can be signed in the country of origin, not just the letter of offer, but the contract can be signed, and that then is officially stamped and officially registered in the country of origin pre-departure. And what that means is that that should flow back to Qatar and to prevent what we call contract substitution. So that many workers sign a contract or get promised certain things before they leave. And when they arrive, they're given another contract that is less advantageous. And that's fraudulent, but it has occurred. Now, the visa centers are designed to overcome that and to stop the these contract substitution. Now, with regard to the costs or the charges that are placed on workers for the recruitment, unfortunately, although things were said that that would be addressed by the visa centers, it is not, because the visa centers are only dealing with people who have already been recruited, and contracts are to be signed and attested and so on and so forth. However, in my view, the education of workers has to actually be pre-recruitment, right, prior to recruitment. And I don't know whether Abrar can talk about it, but I recall Ramru many years ago commissioned a writer to do a script for one of the famous soap operas in Bangladesh, in order to show the kind of problems one gets into if one wants a job abroad, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. But anyway, so unfortunately, there's a limit to the visa centers, and then really not addressing this.
Abrar, you want to chip in?
No, I mean, I'll definitely. I mean, that is where the problem is, and there, as I said, I'll come back to my original position, is that there are a lot of beneficiaries of the system that exists, both in the countries of destination as well as the host country. So although we may hear some noise here and there, and it's good to hear the Qatari government's initiative, but I think those are some of the things our own government need to, sort of catch up and have to be convinced that this is where we would like to sort of intervene. There is this whole idea of they should register in a database as if that is going to solve all problems. So they have not unhooked themselves from those stereotyped, sort of positions. Sub-agents, this is something, registration of sub-agents, civil society is pushing that, and government prime minister has made a declaration that something needs to be done. Parliamentary Standing Committee, Parliamentary Caucus, they're all talking about it. So hopefully we will be able to make some dent. So there are some incremental advances, but not at a pace that we would like.
And contract substitution is also very common in Singapore. We come up against the notion that, listen, if the employer and the employee willingly agree to amend the terms of the employment contract, albeit to a lower salary, why should the government object to what is really a market agreement between two private parties? And so it's very easy for workers to be hired with nice documentation showing one salary, but then 1 month later, the worker ends up signing a new document with a lower salary. And there is this liberal market position that it's free buyer, free seller. So why should the government step in? What would any of you say to that as a kind of some of your concluding remarks? I mean, how socialist do we want to get? Sumitha, Joy, Ray?
I think that's already settled in Malaysia. We had this debate many times before, and it's already settled in Malaysia that you cannot substitute contracts, and that they will only honor the contract that is signed in the country of the country of origin, or even if the worker has signed a second contract here, especially if the second contract is inferior to the first contract. So we have had case laws on that as well. So it's settled in Malaysia. You cannot recognize that kind of contract.
Yeah,
well, that's wonderful. Yes, Abrar.
No, I mean, the whole issue is power issue. And if one does not acknowledge this power issue, then this liberalism, one should jettison with this liberalism, I would say. one must acknowledge these people have gone there. They have made significant investments, with the understanding this is what they are going to get paid. And no one has got any right to bring about change in that. And to invoke, free market principles, I think it's not at all fair. I would stop there.
So let me just ask Joy very quickly.
Can I give you an example?
Okay, sure. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Let me give you an example of what happens in the Philippines. In the Philippines, for domestic workers in particular, but even for women cleaners, the government requires them to have a contract that is at a minimum $400 US. When the women go to the agencies, they are given a contract for $400 basic salary, right? And they say to the workers, look, we're signing this for the government. This is just for the government, but you're not going to get that amount of money. Your employer, we don't want to deceive you. We want to be honest with you and tell you that you're not going to get the 400. So sign the 400, but you're only going to get 250, right? And here is another contract for 250. Now, the worker doesn't get even a copy of that contract, the second one or the first one, right? I've been trying to get workers to give me a copy. They don't have them, right? They keep them in a secret drawer. Now, what's interesting is that the Philippines government have a law called the Joint and Several Liability, which means that if the worker gets less than what was in their contract or what they were promised, the agent in the Philippines is liable to reimburse them for the difference, right? So I remember talking to an agent and saying, well, what happens if a worker comes back and says, you've got to give me the difference? They say, yeah, but we told you, we were honest with you. We told you we're going to get the 400. And I said, well, what if they keep pursuing? He said, well, then we'll pay them because we don't want to go to court and have our reputation tarnished. So that's the game that gets played out, right? And the women, they don't complain because they say, well, I agreed to it. They told me I wasn't going to get it, and I agree. And so there you have it.
So let's ask Joy, okay? In Korea, Bilal or Shafiqul, you can translate for me, please. In Korea, after a new migrant worker has started work, is it possible for the employer to change the salary to less, or does the minimum wage law protect the worker from a lower salary?
Or allowances.
I don't think they have minimum allowances in Korea.
No, but they play around with the allowances.
Joel bhai, হ্যাঁ ভাই, আপনাকে যেটা বলেছে, আপনি কোরিয়া আসার পরে, কোম্পানিতে আসার পরে, কোম্পানির এমপ্লয়ার কি ইচ্ছে করলে আপনি যে বেতনে আসতেছেন সেই বেতনের থেকে কমিয়ে দিতে পারে?
কোরিয়াতে প্রবাসী শ্রমিকরা আসলে তাদেরকে ন্যূনতম বেতনেই কাজ করায়, ওইটার থেকে কোনো মালিকই কম দিতে পারে না। অ্যাকচুয়ালি কোরিয়ানরা যে কাজ করে ওই বেতনে কাজ করে না, কোরিয়ানরা মালিকের সাথে দর কষাকষি করে কাজে ঢুকে এবং ওই ন্যূনতম বেতনের থেকে অনেক উপরে বেতন পায়। শুধু প্রবাসী শ্রমিকরাই ন্যূনতম বেতনে কাজ করে যায়।
Okay.
When migrant workers first come in, they tend to get paid the minimum wages. So, and there's no way really for the employer to pay below the minimum wages. However, if Koreans were to take the same job, they would negotiate with the employer a higher wage.
I guess he said much higher wage. That's what.
A much higher wage.
Thank you, Abrar. Thank you.
Well, did you have more to say beyond that? Did you have more to say?
Who?
Joy?
কিছু বলতে চাচ্ছেন জয় ভাই?
না, কোরিয়াতে যে সিস্টেমটা আছে প্রবাসীদের নিয়ে সম্পূর্ণটাই মালিকের উপর নির্ভর করে। একটা প্রবাসীর জীবনযাপন, কোরিয়ার যে পরিস্থিতিটা, শ্রমিক আইনের যে পরিস্থিতিটা,
the labor laws are heavily biased towards the employer, and the migrant workers are essentially at the mercy of the system, which is geared for the employers.
Debbie, I think we've run out of time, so maybe we can just do our normal courtesies as we close.
Okay. this was just a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad to have heard what the four of you have to say. It was really nice to hear what goes on in other countries, to hear how similar many of these things are with Singapore. There are a few things that are interesting and different, but I would say that in large part, the same kind of situations are being played out in Singapore as well. But thank you all very much for your time, for sharing your thoughts, and for answering our questions. Alex, anything more from you? Sorry, mic's off.
Well, we have lots of people to thank. Of course, we thank William and Migrant Forum in Asia for helping us set this up and introducing us to the speakers. We have our helpful translators, Sharina, Bilal, and Shafiqul, who have actually, even before tonight's session, spent quite a bit of time talking to Joy and getting to know him better and keeping him informed as to how our plans are developing for this. And we have a technical team to thank to have organized this. It's the first time for TWC2 to organize a webinar on such a scale, and obviously we had a lot of learning to do. But most important of all, Debbie, I'm sure you'll agree with me, we want to thank our audience for sparing the time on a weekday night. I hope it's been useful to everybody. I hope we've all learned something in some way or other. And good night, good afternoon, good night to wherever you are, maybe even good morning. So we'll hope to do this again sometime after we've kind of like recovered from this. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
ধন্যবাদ ভাইয়া।